Good morning, everyone, and my thanks to the organizers for getting me out here. I look forward to the entire day setting in material. So, as you know, our topic for the weekend is CRISPR consensus, ? So much is packed into that question mark. Is a consensus possible? How would we achieve it? How would we recognize it if there is a consensus? How would we recognize it if we fail to achieve a consensus? But certainly one of the elements to achieving a consensus is to recognize what the stakes are and who the stakeholders are, who should have a voice in the discussions that Ben outlined for us at the beginning of the day. I want to start with just two anecdotes to give, I hope, a sense of the range of opinion that is out there. One comes from a new CRISPR documentary. It's called Human Nature. It's been making the rounds of film festivals, but is not yet in commercial distribution. One of the people in Human Nature is a young man. He's a teenager. He has sickle cell disease. He is in the clinical trial that is attempting to cure his sickle cell disease. It's somatic editing, as Lee explained to us, not germline editing. But toward the end, the filmmakers asked him, so David, one day it might be possible if you were to choose to have children for the embryos that you and your partner make through IVF to be changed so that the sickle cell gene that you have would not be passed on to your children. What do you think about that? And again, this is a teenager. And he thought about this for some minutes, and then he said, I can see how that might be desirable and how some parents or future parents might want to go in that direction. But for me, he said, I don't think I would be the person I am today if I did not have sickle cell. So I leave you with that thought. Another one is, in one of the stories I did about germline editing, I spoke to a number of parents, families who have a rare genetic disorder. And as we might get into later, many families who have heritable genetic disorders can avoid passing those disorders to their children if they choose to go have assisted reproduction and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select out embryos that carry the disease-causing mutation. For a few families, depending on very complicated patterns of inheritance, it will not be possible to do that, to have biological children who do not carry the disease-causing mutation. So again, I was speaking to a mother, actually, and we were going over some of the scholarly, ethical, other arguments against germline editing, many of which I think you'll hear this weekend. And one of them was the idea that the human gene pool is the common inheritance of humanity. And she said, she totally gets that. It's a huge decision, but can't I just change my little drop of the human gene pool so that my children don't have this terrible thing that I have? One more, not a story, but sort of a variation on an old joke about how we achieve consensus and then how we implement it. There is the old joke about democracy cannot be two wolves and one sheep voting on what to have for dinner. So, as we proceed, let me introduce our panelists. At my far left is Mohammed Ghali. He's professor of Islam and biomedical ethics at the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. His work focuses on the intersection of Islamic ethics and biomedical sciences, including the ethics of human germline editing. Next to him, we have Keolu Fox, who's assistant professor of biological anthropology at UC San Diego. He is also an indigenous rights activist, and his research focuses on questions of functionalizing genomics, which involves putting to the test theories of natural selection by editing genes and determining the function of the mutations. Using genome editing technologies, he examines the effects of genetic variants assumed to be under natural selection, such as thrifty genes in Polynesians. Next to me is Billy Liangulu, who is a genetic counselor here at UC San Francisco. Billy specializes in prenatal care, working closely with perinatologists to educate families on potential genetic risks for fetal abnormalities and inherited disease. And remotely, as you have heard, we have Gregor Wolbring, who is associate professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences and a leading scholar of disability studies at the University of Calgary. In addition, he is a biochemist. And again, he is joining us remotely. Although I have utmost faith in the technology, I wanted to start with Gregor's presentation. We'll have each of our panelists talk for just a few minutes to set the stage in terms of what their research, scholarship, and work brings to this conversation. So if you could tee up Gregor's presentation, that would be great.
As to the stakeholders, everyone is a stakeholder. I have certain assumptions. The lens of ability expectation and ableism is a useful one. Talking about germline gene editing is too narrow, the prevailing medical safety focus is too narrow, the prevailing discourse exhibits and needs the patient flavor of disabled people, and there is a need for ability expectation governance. As to assumption 1, the concept of ableism was developed by the disabled people's rights movement to question normative body ability expectations and the ability privileges, for example, ability to have paid work, to gain education, to be part of society, to have an accepted identity, that come with an ability normative body, and the disableism, the negative treatment of the ones judged as impaired as ability wanted. Ability expectation would be nice to have certain abilities in ableism. Certain abilities are seen as absolutely essential, are cultural dynamics used to define oneself and others on the individual all the way to the nation level, and is an influential factor in the engagement and disengagement between people and nations. Ability expectations and ableism impact and shape human-human, human-animal, and human-nature relationship. Ability expectation and ableism can be used to disable or enable. Cognitive abilities are, for example, used to justify racism. See the book Bell Curve. Sustainable development was developed as a concept to have a better ability expectations human in relation to nature. Talking about germline gene editing is too narrow, because it assumes other areas such as somatic gene editing or even pre-selection on the fetus and embryo level are not problematic, which is not the case. The prevailing medical safety debate is too narrow, because the medical safety debate has specific boundaries, focus, and measures of success or failure, which do not capture many of the problems. You can see here just a table which shows clearly that safety is mentioned much more than, for example, justice and equity. The prevailing discourse exhibits and needs the patient flavor of disabled people. This table shows that we have a discourse more on the medical patient flavor. Right, patient, you see many more hits than with disabled people or people with disabilities. The term disabled people and people with disabilities are often used to depict the social group of disabled people and the social issues they face, which does not fit the medical safety focus, whereby the term patient is mostly used to focus on the medical aspect, including medical safety of the disabled patient. I say there's a need for ability expectation governance. To quote the eminent ethicist Susan Sherwin, we lack the appropriate intellectual tools for promoting deep moral change in our society. In many societal settings, ethical reasoning might not be the deciding factor, but the utility of the intervention to fulfill a highly valued ability expectation. This might be one cause of the lack of influence of ethicists perceived by Sherwin. Achieving political and social change happens, among others, through ability expectation changes. As to the governance discussions, they assume many abilities of the public, including disabled people, the public does not have. Here's a picture. You can get this from my student Lucy Deep master thesis. It's online, open access. There are many barriers for disabled people to take part in discussions. Let me finish by thanking my research students who do such great work and the organizers for allowing me to contribute to this conference by virtual. Thank you.
Gregor, if you can hear me, I wanted to ask you just one question, which is if you could just tell us why you are joining us remotely rather than here at Berkeley.
Simply travel is just too hard. Unpredictable, who knows who is striking where and which plane is going, and simply, right, you're getting older. Right, overuse the body due to non-accommodation, right, realities in society, right. I'm with genetics since 1988. So I have a lot of gray hair, as you can see, and that comes with the same as a sports person. You overuse your body, you pay a price eventually, and I pay the price now that I had to overuse the body constantly.
Thank you. Mohammed, give us a little sense of the kind of thinking that you've been doing about this subject.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. I want to start by a few introductory remarks about what we mean when we say Islamic bioethics or Islamic bioethical perspectives. Having me here may give with my title as Professor of Islamic Biomedical Ethics, may give the wrong impression that this is the norm. We have also professors in Islamic bioethics like the professors we have here in so many subspecialization even in Islamic bioethics, which is not the case. If I'm not mistaken, this is one of the only positions with this title in the Muslim world. Islamic bioethical deliberations in the Muslim, when it comes to the Islamic tradition, falls within religious discourse. So the people who involve in these discussions usually and normally should be religious scholars and Islamic studies specialists. Due to some factors, some of them related to education system, and some of them related to our age of modernity. We don't have the time to get into that. It becomes interdisciplinary discussions. So we will not have the religious scholars only. That should have been normally the case, but we will have with them on the table other stakeholders, especially biomedical scientists and geneticists and genomicists when we talk about the topic that we discuss. So we have interdisciplinary discussions not represented by one specialist, like a bioethicist, but we will have interdisciplinary discussions represented by different specialists. By the beginning of the 1980s, we have an institutionalization process of these interdisciplinary discussions. Till now, so far we have 3 main institutions based in the Muslim world. These institutions are transnational institutions, hosting groups of religious scholars, biomedical scientists, and sometimes law specialists and law experts discussing a wide range of topics, including those related to genetics and genomics. Two are based in Saudi Arabia, and one is based in Kuwait. So these are not Saudi or Kuwaiti organizations. These are transnational Islamic organizations where every Muslim country is represented by at least 1 or 2, and sometimes also countries with great number of Muslims living as religious minorities, like those in India or some in Western countries. These institutions, specifically these 3 institutions, have been deliberating on issues related to genomics and genetics since 1993. Started the discussions. So we have a phase from 1993 till 2013, and from 2013 is another phase. Between 1993 and 2013, the discussions were more or less focusing on at this time, the new project, Human Genome Project, which started in the US just a couple of years before, in the 1990, and then they started the debates. The key question at this time is that should we, Muslim countries, be part of this genomic revolution coming on or not? This was the key question. From 2013, we come to different sets of questions. By the end of 2013, December 2013, both Saudi Arabia and Qatar started their national genome project for sequencing people in their countries. National project. This was after coming to important conclusions, mainstreaming the perspectives on Islamic ethics and genomics, saying that joining the genomic revolution is not just an ethical act, it's not just a good option, but it is actually a collective duty that Muslims have to be part of the genomic revolution. Funds must be available for this type of research. Collaboration with main institutions worldwide must be prioritized at the national level for Muslim countries. This position was adopted by the three institutions I speak about in November 2013. December 2013, we see the launching of the project to the public. From 2013 till now, we started not anymore the whether question, should we be part of this revolution or not, but we started to have specific questions, how question, how this should be done. So we will have questions about, for instance, ethical management of incidental findings. We will have questions about gene therapy. We'll have questions about gene editing and the discussions that we have today. This is more or less the historical overview of the discussions, and then later we can discuss more about that. The final point that I want to say is that when I say personally Islamic bioethical perspectives, I'm speaking about those who participate in these interdisciplinary collective discussions and type of reasoning. These discussions are marked by a strong diversity of opinions. The diversity of opinions and sometimes even conflicting perspectives that we have here in the West is not something exclusively Western, but it's because also of the type of questions that we address. These are new questions. We didn't have them for centuries before, like the other questions that we have and we still didn't resolve yet. So these are new questions. You try to link your answer to a specific moral tradition. When it comes to Islam, we think about moral tradition which has been there for at least 14 centuries. So it's very difficult to link these new questions to a moral world which is quite old, to give a question an answer relative to the question, to the modern question, but rooted in the tradition. This is usually the big question that we have. These types of answers and deliberations diverse also because there is internal diversity in the Islamic tradition. We don't have one type of Islam and Islamic tradition. You have Shia scholars, like what we have in Iran and in Iraq, and you have Sunni, the majority, and each also tradition has its own specificities. When we come later, we may talk about these details.
And before I let you go for now, Mohammed, in a recent paper, you described how Muslim moral scholars reach the conclusion, believe that one should take a precautionary, or that Islamic teaching says that we should take a precautionary approach, I think, to germline editing, but that it is not absolutely prohibited, but recognizing again that there's a diversity of views on this. Is that sort of the kernel of Islamic moral scholarship?
Usually they make a difference between research, that you study that, and you apply it. At the level of research, usually it's quite open, because research, it's about seeking knowledge, which is highly valued virtue in the Islamic tradition, that you know yourself, that you know the universe. These are the ways through which you know God. So this is something that should remain open. So no problem. When it comes to application, they would differentiate between editing adult cells and editing germline cells. Adult cells, much more open. Germline, they would be open if it is for medical treatment purposes. If it is for enhancement purposes, they would be much more cautious about that. So normally speaking, editing adult cells, number one, the least controversial for medical purposes, then germline editing for medical purposes, then adult germline cell editing for enhancement purposes, then the most controversial one, germline editing for enhancement purposes, with all the difficulties that we can have about the borderline between medical treatment and enhancement, etc.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kilo, let us turn to you. Did your PowerPoint load, or are you
don't
just
worry
going
about it.
to
It's going to
wing
just
it?
blind me anyway.
Okay, go for it.
All right, nice to meet everyone. Just wanted to say thank you for having me here and having this discussion about things that are emerging technologies, but also I just want to stress how ubiquitous something like genome editing technology is. And it's not that it's new, right? We've known about this since Paul Berg in 1980. He was awarded a Nobel Prize for recombinant technology. It's that it's cheaper, more accessible, and more reproducible than ever, right? So I'm not a bioethicist. I'm just Hawaiian. so that kind of for me, it's sort of a different stake that's going on here, and I'll kind of explain what I mean. So rather than focusing on this whole idea of this brave new world of health disparities that's manifesting as a result of the application of these technologies, right? Which is very real, and we're going to have conversations about that throughout the next 2 days. But I'd like to think about using this tool to actually rewrite history. And so what do I mean by that? There's one of my favorite scholars is Martin Luther King Jr., and he has this amazing quote, and we're not makers of history, we're made by it. And so I take that to mean it's like we've sequenced and begun to sequence this kind of comprehensive full spectrum of human genetic variation that exists. However, 90-something% of this has really exclusively featured individuals of European ancestry. So we're not really understanding everyone's human genetic variation. We're understanding one population's. And so what that does is, if you complement that statistic with the statistic that 95% of clinical trials also exclusively feature individuals of European ancestry, you see the writing on the wall for the future of predictive, preventative, and personalized medicine, because we're not allowing everyone to participate. So there's this inclusivity and exclusivity that's going on. This is highly problematic because we're not learning about human genetic variation in context of the environment. So when we talk about indigenous communities that have been living and sequestered in certain populations for over 50,000 years per se, we're no different than Darwin's finches, right? Like, we are a reflection of our ecosystem. We are our genetic variation that you observe, everything from curly hair to straight hair, skin color, people's eye color, all of these things are a reflection of the way we interface with the environment. You talked about sickle cell anemia. What does anybody know why that young man in front, why does that exist? Do you know? Does anybody? Malaria, exactly. It's population genetics 101. It's a reflection of, and actually it's a reflection of modernity. It's a reflection of like agriculture, which gets to standing water, which gets to mosquitoes. And now you get, right? Okay, so that's a story that we create using evolution, using human genetic variation. That's real. It makes sense. It checks out. It's not a just so story, which is something that Stephen Jay Gould and Lewontin would say around these like adaptionist arguments around a genetic mutation. So because we've only sequenced only a fraction of kind of indigenous people's genomes, people can make these just so or false narratives, evolutionary narratives that are in a lot of cases racist and not really ground in truth. And I don't think it's far-fetched to say that they're racist, and there's institutionalized racism that goes on around access to this technology, the democratization of it, and self-governance of it. So what we can do with CRISPR, and what I'm doing, is we're revisiting these narratives. So you say you sequenced you found a mutation in Polynesia that is thrifty. and that predisposes to obesity but protects against type 2 diabetes. And you create a whole narrative around voyaging and how my ancestors didn't have enough access to provisions on the boats, and that's why we have really high rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity. But the reality is that's a consequence of separating people from fishing rights, hunting rights, replacing our subsistence agriculture with Spam, white rice, and soy sauce, right? Like, this is the narrative that's going on all over the world. So we can actually take a tool like CRISPR and reverse engineer mutations into stem cells, differentiate them, and refine what's going on mechanistically. You say Nepalese people have a mutation that is for hypoxia and high altitude elevation. Prove it. Now we can do this in real ways like never before, and it's cheap and it's reproducible, and it's a beautiful way to think about science and the way we repatriate individual communities' histories. You can also do this with Neanderthal mutations. You could take a Neanderthal mutation. We're doing this, forthcoming research in Science, please cite it. You can move that into a stem cell and you can ask questions about intergression. What came from a Neanderthal and what did not? What only existed in Neanderthals and might have led to their demise? And you can look at these things in cellular models and make data. This is like one of the coolest features of genome editing, right? It's very positive, and it allows us to rewrite history. Now, there's a dark side to this as well, right? Because as much as we want to repatriate our history, we also have to worry about the fact that people want to create intellectual property around these individual mutations. And there was a famous court case, Mary Claire King versus Myriad Genetics, that kind of led to this kind of gray area around creating actual patent claims around mutations, but that doesn't mean that you can't be more subtle about identifying domains in an indigenous population that might lead to the development of a blockbuster drug. And then what? Now you're talking about treating indigenous people's genomes just like cobalt, gold, oil, timber, etc. And that's a dangerous idea. Because if we don't put indigenous people in the driver's seats or vulnerable populations so that they can really think about the potential applications of this type of technology, self-governance, and how to create intellectual property that has a circular economy that goes back into their community, that is continued colonialism in 2020. And there are so many different patents that are coming out. I encourage you to look these things up. There's one that was recently released from Brown University, an individual named Steve McGarvey, we're watching you. And there were no Polynesian people on this patent claim, not one name. And it surrounds a mutation that might lead to drugs that are relevant for metabolic disease. So I just wanted to bring up a number of different ways that we can use this and think about CRISPR.
So in my never-ending quest for optimism and sort of good news, is there any example in history of where a biological resource that comes from an underserved community, a community that is not highly represented in science? I'm going back to is it the periwinkle from which a leukemia drug was derived? Sure. There's been lots of controversy about, for instance, strains of viruses, and can you make a vaccine against that, and who profits? Anyway, the question is there one example that you can point to that I'm looking at your expression that gives us hope that the kind of exploitation that you just outlined for us will not happen, or that there's an avenue to make it not happen? Right.
That's a great question. First of all, I would say probably not, right? Insofar, I mean, we could probably debate kind of smaller examples here or there. I think what you have to do is create an infrastructure for self-governance, right? So you create biorepositories like in Eagle Butte and the Lakota Reservation, the first indigenous biorepository where indigenous communities can store their own samples and blood and things like this. You provide people with access to server farms and algorithm development. You think about the way in which we've biased so many different algorithms that we create. Like there's a great book, Algorithms of Oppression. Like, go in your Google search bar, put in Black women, see what comes up. You know what I mean? You already know. And so we're kind of combating all of those components because there's so many different pieces to this pipeline that are complex. But really, I mean, in thinking about intellectual property and creating royalties around this, you have to train people in ways that they can serve their community and really build that capacity for self-governance. And we're doing that in a lot of ways, and I'd be happy to talk about that later.
Thank you. Billy, so you're closest to where, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, this being germline editing is going to happen or not. And the reason I say that is take mitochondrial therapy, which is illegal in this country. A family went to a fertility clinic in New York. They said, please fix our embryos. The physician said, sure. And they all went to Mexico. And we then had the first birth of from the United States, this is legal in the UK, of a so-called 3-parent child. So where there is, it seems, a patient demand and existing science, there will be a way. But my question to you is if you could just give us a sense from your conversations with parents, with prospective parents, just what kind of things you're hearing about attitudes toward germline editing.
So I hope I can sound as profound as these two next to me. But my work is in the clinic, and oftentimes my work is with people who are pregnant, currently pregnant, who are facing a diagnosis in their pregnancy that was unanticipated, that is a wanted pregnancy, that we're working with them to try to clarify why this happened and try to clarify what to expect from that child. And a lot of the work that I'm actively doing, I'm working on 2-3 research studies where we're trying to either identify genetic causes to congenital anomalies that have been identified in an active pregnancy, or working on in utero therapy for alpha thalassemia, also hereditary anemia like sickle cell anemia, working really closely with those populations, hopefully in a thoughtful and ethical way. We work with Hawaiian patients. I'm going there in just a few weeks, lucky me, because we're trying to help understand the needs of these patients. We've had focus groups for beta thalassemia looking at gene editing and in utero stem cell transplantation. So when you talk about germline editing, you're talking about something that you can anticipate and fix. And the reality is that most patients have a diagnosis that was unanticipated. And so I am not hearing much about germline editing because I'm working with families that are facing a problem in their current very wanted pregnancy. However, interestingly enough, we are developing these in utero therapies, and a lot of the work that we're doing is to look at the cells of the fetus to try to find out why what is happening. There's a problem called hydrops, where fetuses will develop collections of fluid in different compartments of their body, around their heart and their lungs, in the abdomen, or under the skin. And we know that a certain component of those diagnoses can be viral or environmental or due to a congenital anomaly like a cardiac defect, but also a subset of these conditions are due to inborn errors of metabolism and genetic diagnoses that many groups are working very actively at developing therapies that are introduced after a baby's born and after that diagnosis occurs postnatally. So we're working really hard to move that diagnosis prenatally to hopefully understand what conditions cause this complication, and about a third is thought to be metabolic, these types of conditions that your body's just not making what it needs to break down certain proteins, that introducing that thing that your body's not making could then ameliorate that complication. When those therapies are introduced after a baby's born, you have some damage that's already been done and it's irreversible. So potentially if we can introduce those therapies before a baby's done, before the baby's born, some of those injuries and insults that happen during that development can be corrected. And we recently worked with a patient who had a baby born with one of these conditions and then was pregnant again. And her family reached out to the pharmaceutical company that made the enzyme that was offered to their child that is now deceased and said, what can be done? We have another pregnancy, and this pregnancy is also affected. And we worked hard to try to make a therapy available to them. In the pregnancy, we got FDA approval, and then the pregnancy had complications that precluded us from being able to try this approach. And the mom just this past week actually went in for an ultrasound, and there was a fetal demise. The baby didn't survive. And we were talking to her, and I was texting with her and sending my condolences and how can I support you? And she said, have you heard of Crispr? And it's so timely. And my homework assignment from her was to watch another program, which I don't know if I should be citing or not, but it's not This Human Nature, which I'll look at when it's publicly available, but Unnatural Selection. And I started watching it on the lift right here thinking, shoot, should I be cramming for this? And it was interesting, though, because this is a patient from an underrepresented population. She's African American, and she's on all these different support groups and hashtag this condition. And she's like, Billy, I'm looking around, and why is nobody Black that has this diagnosis? There's it is very much an access to care and accessing care, both sides. And we know that history with genetics is wrought with a lot of wrongdoings and then also good intentions that can go wrong. And so there's a community of distrust in those communities. And I was talking to her, and, everything's a rare disease, and I don't know. I know a lot about genetics, but you can't know about every syndrome. So her asking me this, is it just not common in the Black population, or is it why? And I'm like, I haven't looked at the ethnic background. To my knowledge, it's a pan-ethnic condition, but there are these issues of access to care and accessing care that may be why you and people like you are underrepresented in these support groups. Maybe the diagnosis had never been made. Maybe these babies were born, never understood why, because they didn't have access to sophisticated testing to clarify that diagnosis. But I will look into it for you, and I will watch Unnatural Selection so that we can have a conversation about that may be meaningful to you and edifying for me as well. So that's actually the first time a patient asked me about CRISPR, which happens to be like right before I'm here and trying to sound smart and be the voice of these patients and also the voice of the clinic. Kelly Ormond is here, and we were chatting before because she'll be talking later, and we recognized from the speaker list that maybe we're just the only ones here that actually work with patients. And so hopefully I will be able to do that well. But I think one thing we have to recognize when we talk about germline editing is many patients are confronted with the diagnosis that it's just too late for germline editing. And so it's sophisticated and sexy and awesome, but we also have to recognize that the reality is things like sickle cell and somatic gene editing, where beta thal and bluebird now has the FDA approval, these are the real issues that patients are thinking about on a day-to-day. And is this emerging therapy going to be meaningful for us, or is this another kind of flash in the pan, really exciting, and then 3 or 5 years down the road, we find our friends that had accepted the therapy and decided to move forward having downstream consequences of that? Is it a bigger risk than a benefit? And also, this diagnosis has defined us in those same ways, because facing the challenges of a diagnosis can also be very edifying and meaningful and make you who you are. And so that's what I've heard from patients, only once about CRISPR.
So I'm going to put Billy and Gregor on the spot in 1 second, but I just wanted to mention that in a few minutes, I'll open this up to questions from the audience, both those of you who are here in body and those of you who are here only through electrons. So be thinking what you might want to ask our panelists. So I'm sensing one point of interesting connection or perhaps disconnection between Billy and Gregor, and it has to do with, so as you said, Billy, in many cases, the pregnancy is underway, whether it was through the old-fashioned way of getting pregnant or even IVF. So we're past being able to CRISPR the germline, but I'm guessing we are not past the possibility of termination. So I just want to put that out there for a second and ask. So it's possible to choose not to bring into the world a child that will have a significant medical complication. So my question is whether, so that's called, there's this new thing called liberal eugenics, right? Or the new eugenics, which is the idea not that the powers that be up here will say who may and may not, who shall and shall not reproduce and how, et cetera, but rather the parents and would-be parents themselves are choosing as much as they can what kind of children to have and not have. So here we have what we might call reproductive rights, reproductive freedom. On the other side of that is, are we going to get to a point in society where parents who have chosen to bring into the world a child who has severe problems will be regarded by society as having made a terrible decision in some sense. And if that happens, will the people who have these medical problems be regarded as somehow mistakes that should never have been brought into the world? So I'm just wondering if, again, that's any kind of I'm going back to the woman I spoke to who said, fine, talk about your common heritage of humanity, human gene pool, all you want. I just want what's best for my child. So my question, Billy, is whether that is any kind of an idea, a thought, a conversation that at all enters into the interactions that you have with patients, with your families, or that they bring up themselves.
A concern for making a decision because they're worried that if they continue a pregnancy, they'll be thought of as wrong.
Yes.
I think most often the conversations I have with patients are a concern for making a decision that they will be challenged about for stopping a pregnancy.
Okay.
I think oftentimes patients don't know, and I think oftentimes in the greater community. So I'm on Facebook, or not so much anymore, but I once was, and I very much support reproductive rights. And there was like a fundraiser for Planned Parenthood. And one of my friends' moms was like, how dare you support Planned Parenthood, you know? And then you have to worry about or think about how to navigate that commentary and think about how to understand where she's coming from, but also recognize the lack of understanding that she has about these choices patients are faced with. And so we work in a kind of niche world. I work at the University of California, San Francisco Fetal Treatment Center. So you'll also want to recognize that many of the patients that I see are patients choosing to proceed with the pregnancy and access care to try to make available the best opportunities for their fetuses and children. But I honestly have not, I guess what we try to do, and perhaps we're successful at it, is allow for patients to recognize that whatever choice they make and that it's their choice, and to have an opportunity to choose therapies for their child, even recognizing that their child will have challenges in the world, health problems, you know, thinking of not just intellectual disability or developmental delays, but we have people that are referred to us because their fetus has such a complex cardiac defect that they will be offered, you know, a 3-stage cardiac repair. There's a 50% chance of survival, and maybe by 10 they'll be offered a heart transplant. So all of these things that we think about as far as congenital anomalies aren't necessarily genetic, although they may be caused by a genetic finding, but these are complex life choices to recognize quality of life and accept what is an appropriate quality of life for their child. And I've never heard of anyone saying, will I be questioned for this acceptance? I've mostly heard patients concerned about how to make a decision that's meaningful, to be brave. And just last week, I think in the New York Times, there was an op-ed about a woman who terminated a pregnancy at 23 weeks and 6 days because of a severe central nervous system anomaly that was identified in her fetus, and she chose to terminate. And her commentary, which I suggest you all read, was really beautifully written because she chose that was not the life that she wanted for her child, and she decided to take on those sorrows for herself instead of continuing the pregnancy and having those sorrows and struggles for that baby. And I think many people really struggle with that, the guilt of choosing to stop a pregnancy and deciding what's best for that child that's wanted. In any context, most often they are wanted, but not will they judge me for continuing? Although I do hear that voice also, or families saying, with the alpha thalassemia study that we're working on, deciding to be courageous and choose therapy, and then their family saying, this is too much for you, why are you doing this? But that's probably the lesser voice.
Thank you.
That's a big voice to present to someone. I think that you have to be really close to someone to challenge them to accept.
Gregor, if you're still with us, recognizing that the disability community is far from monolithic, I wonder if you would just jump in here about the tension, if that's the right word, between reproductive freedom choice, I want to CRISPR my embryo, and what kind of world, if we want to fast forward a number of decades, that might look like if in terms of people who have disabilities?
Well, as to the monolithic one, no group is monolithic, so it's not the feminist movement, right? You have feminists in favor of abortion and feminists against abortion, so I don't buy that even the line of, inquiry normally when people talk about the disabled people are not monolithic. No group is. And we don't use that as an argument to discredit certain parts of the non-monolithic ones because they're not monolithic. Where we are going, right, as you could see from the PowerPoint, I see bigger picture. So if we are talking about really genetic testing in the moment, which was the last speaker mostly, and then what we do, people ask for sex selection prohibition, right? But they don't ask for ability deselection or non-ability deselection prohibition. And the arguments used for sex selection prohibition, literally every single one can be applied to any characteristic you're deselecting against. Right? That is not sex-related. The only one literally you can't use is because one of the arguments against sex selection is saying you are not a disease. Well, and then we're getting to whether, right, who is a disease or not. And of course, there we have then, is death a disease? Well, deaf culture would say no. Right? Other people say yes. Neurodiversity says no. A lot of autism, ADHD say yes. Right? So then it really becomes all of a sudden a debate about who defines the person and who, right, and sets the parameters. Right? And that's, I think, where we actually are. That's why you need the bigger picture. There was an article in the Seattle Times, by now maybe 10 years ago, by Susan Keller, saying that 80% of Americans are officially diseased, right? And we had a CNN article, right, which reflected on the Pew study. As soon as you use disease as an argument, you can literally sell everything, right, including genetic interventions and so on, because disease simply is having a different moral, ethical, social debate, right, which I called a long time ago animal farm philosophy, right, which is really where we are, right? As soon as you can, push yourself out of the medical narrative, that's why the gay community is so adamant that they are not a disease, right, which is actually not that old. At the beginning, they actually wanted to be a disease, because they figured if we're a disease, then we're natural. And then the disability community was telling them, you're stupid. Only because you're a disease, and therefore biological, doesn't lead to acceptance. Right? And now, of course, it's evil even to think about the gay gene, because they know if you're a disease, we will look for, in essence, right, a fix. Right? And so we really have to think about right, how does it play itself in a society which becomes, in many places, increasingly individualistic, where we do not even want to have a universal healthcare coverage because then someone else has to pay, fees go up. Marteau has already published in the 90s a study showing that the blame factor against women goes up because, well, you could have done X, Y, Z, you didn't because you had the test, you had the right, and you didn't do the right thing. And that all has nothing to do with the technologies. These are all social aspects, right, which I think we haven't even resolved. Despite that we're working on that stuff for 30 years, I think we are going increasingly into a tribalism. Smaller groups can relate to each other, and if you're not on my side, I blame you. And under that kind of framework, these technologies are getting developed, and they're platform technologies, right? You use it in the US. If it's working, it can be used somewhere else, right? It can be a DIY, right? Community science labs. I mean, it doesn't have to be a big, right? I mean, university or right state-driven, thing. And so that's why I think where we really have a problem, because the social framework is not such that this will be used, I think, in a positive way, or even stop at the so-called severe diseases. It didn't stop there with genetic testing, and it will not stop there with, therapy.
Yes. So on that optimistic note, let me, in the interest of keeping us vaguely on schedule, let me open it up to audience questions. I don't know if we have a microphone. And in the back, I think we have a microphone. Yes. If you have a question, just wave your hand or arm. And Kevin, if we have some from the online audience, if you could also just somehow let me know that I should say that. So, so I can't read these.
The questions on the confidence monitor, if you could.
I'm happy to, because I can't read any of the questions, but if any of them relate to me, I'm happy if someone sends them to me, or whoever votes them sends me an email. I'm happy to also answer them by email after the event.
Okay.
Because there are many questions there from what I can see.
Yeah. Okay, we're not going to get to all of them,
no.
obviously. So,
so we can compile these questions too and put them on the website in the comments, so you can see what everyone's thinking. We might. So picking one from here as they're streaming in, there was I think a great one for Billy. So what does informed consent look like in an age of CRISPR? Like what does real informed consent look like?
Well, we are grappling with how to provide informed consent for sequencing to identify the genetic diseases. I think we'll have to discuss informed consent when it comes to gene editing, be it germline or somatic, down the road. I think people need to know first what you're looking for, what you're potentially learning about before you're deciding what's found and how to edit it. But I don't know well enough. I don't think any of us know well enough. I don't think it's my own naivety. I think we don't really know the downstream consequences yet. I don't think we've found the ability to be so precise in our ability to edit to truly give informed consent. And because of that, I think that has to wait.
Thank you. So I can't read these, but
unfortunately it's kind of small.
I can't read those either. But we have a live question. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much for all of these talks. I had a question for Professor Ghali. Could you inform us as to the position if there's a homogen. If there's a single, thank you, Ada. Is there a single position in Islam relative to pregnancy termination, to abortion? And I think it would be very interesting for us to know that what that position would be in this framework of gene editing.
Thank you. Usually here in the US, you have pro-life and pro-choice. We don't have this division even in the Islamic tradition. We, generally speaking, religious scholars speak about the borderline 120 days in pregnancy. So before 120, calculated, by the way, from the moment of fertilization, not from the 2 weeks before pregnancy starts. So 120 days of pregnancy from the moment of conception and after. Why is this borderline? Because there is a belief in ensoulment, that after 120 days, we have an ensouled embryo. You have the soul of the human being. So the embryo starts to have human life, not just life. So before 120 days, usually there is a space for abortion, as long as there is valid reason. And the whole debate will be about what makes some excuses valid and the others not. Most of the time, the majority of religious scholars would see severe diseases, incurable, which make the life of the prospective child and the family quite miserable, very short, etc. That's a valid reason. For the majority at least. For some would add much more other types of opinions, like for instance, if it is the state of the country, if we have a country torn by war, there is no health infrastructure, etc. Can this be a good reason, etc. So they would anyhow put as a condition the consent of the parents, that they want to do that, that's what they ask, and that there is a valid reason. After 120 days, there is only one reason, that the life of the mother is in danger, not the health, but the life of the mother is in danger, and we have to choose between two lives, the actual life of the mother or the prospective life of the child, so we give more weight to the actual than to the prospective. This is squeezing very much the discussions.
I see one up here that I'd like to take, since we're about stakeholders. A questioner asks, what about, or how do you factor in the next generation in this debate? How do you give them a voice? I have no idea myself, but would any of our panelists like to speak to how the next generation, I think they mean the unborn generation, can be a stakeholder here and how you can assess what it would want? Mohammed.
Can I say something within the context of the discussions within the Islamic tradition? Usually people are differentiated into those who have legal capacity and those who do not. Those who have legal capacity, it means they are adult, they have the cognitive capacities, etc. And those who do not, either because they are minor or whatever. So embryos, they fall under those who do not have legal capacity with whatever definition we try to make. What we see in the discussions that started in the 90s, that in the case of germline gene editing, it's not a big deal to take their consent, because we have the guardians, we have those who can give proxy consent, these are the parents. As long as the parents are okay, then it's fine. By time we started to have it, to see how much more problematic it is than what it is perceived. Because it's not a decision that can be reversed. You can decide for me to go to an international or a local school. You can decide for me to then I can reverse this later on, but this cannot be reversed. So much more problematic now than it is. Yes.
Life is complicated.
Yes.
Kirill, could you read the one that is addressed to you?
Yeah, sure. It says
Give it a try,
Fox
if you would.
Keolu. Is this thing on? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's why I have glasses. Yeah. How would increases in genetic information ownership, e.g., example, among minorities, influence the ability to have large-scale studies that may be necessary for discoveries and advances? So I think what we're sort of, is everyone familiar with the All of Us project? Is anyone familiar? Well, if you're not, there's this kind of large-scale initiative to use $212 million per year. It's a large amount of money over the next 5 years to sequence 1 million people's genomes in the United States of America. And they want to oversample for underrepresented minorities. So they're trying to get a greater percent, like 50-something% of that data set will be basically underrepresented minorities. There are a lot of issues with that. I mean, I think there's this idea about intent and impact that's going on here. You want to learn about minority health specific variation, and you want to make new avenues for predictive and preventative health, but at the same time, you're sort of undermining communities of people's sovereignty and rights. So I'm an advocate for it's your genome, it's your information, you can do what you like with it. I personally wouldn't give my genome to 23andMe, for example, for $150. This is a commodity, it's information. There's a really good doc on this too called The Great Hack. And I mean, and you're seeing this emergence of information as the #1 commodity on planet Earth. Like, it's stored, it's mined, it's aggregated. Why would you give it away for free? So it's really about your personal sovereignty. But then when we get into large scale government initiatives, you see that the United States of America as a whole is undermining sovereign indigenous groups in America. And so they kind of have to take their own information into their own hands. So again, self-governance. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. So we're actually at the end of our time. If we have one question from the room, or how are we going to pick from all of these here, Lee? Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. As you know, 92% of the human genome catalog is European. So in terms of the catalog, a lot of non-Europeans are going to be the basis for CRISPR. So as somebody mentioned in the other CRISPR conference in Madison, Wisconsin, as climate crisis becomes more acute, people from the equator whose crops and bodies are adapted to that are going to be wanted in the north for CRISPR improvement, so that during the hotter weather and the lower moisture, those things, people and plants can survive. So what would you say about that in terms of the power balance between the equatorial people and people in the north?
Kyola, do you want to try that one?
Ooh, I'll try it. I mean, I think there's again, that's the idea. I mean, obviously.
The question since it didn't.
It's a complicated question, but certain people are adapted for certain things and certain crops are adapted for certain things, right? I think the greater conversation and education around these things, if you say GMO in Hawaii, people go crazy. They're like, no, this is, so we need to create a greater education around this. But also I think, safeguarding the potential use of this information comes back to the intellectual property and who actually gets a cut of this and who gets disenfranchised and who gets undermined. It's up for a longer extended conversation. Yeah, if anybody else wants to chime in.
I was going to say, so at least those of you who are here can indeed have more conversations with our panelists during the break. But let me stop now. So again, we're sort of on schedule, and join me in thanking our panelists.